Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we'll be visiting with Ruth Weiss, an English instructor here at the Valle Verde campus. Ruth is going to tell us about the Borderlands publication, how that's put together every year, and tell us a little bit about some of El Paso's history. Ruth, welcome to Along the Rio Grande.
Thank you so much for having me, George.
You've been with the college for a while, teaching English here?
Yes, I've been here just about 15 years.
And you teach a variety of different courses? What types of things?
Yes, of course, I teach the freshman composition courses, and with my favorite one being the English 3112, the research, writing, and introduction to literature. And then I also have taught the introduction to drama, and the first part of British literature, and world literature, and last year I even had the pleasure of teaching a women's studies course. So I've taught a great many courses here.
And I assume it's from those classes that you're able to recruit some of the students that work on Borderlands every year?
Absolutely. I almost have a captive audience because in the past few years I've been using my own 3112 classes as the source of the research and the stories that I use in Borderlands.
Great. Maybe we should explain what Borderlands is. What exactly is Borderlands?
Okay, Borderlands is at this time, a newspaper supplement that comes out every spring in the El Paso Times. It arrives with a Sunday edition, and it has evolved from a project begun many, many years ago. It has stories. It has stories, articles, feature articles on different topics on the southwestern El Paso area, northern Mexico, and southwestern New Mexico.
So it's kind of a regional publication.
Very
in a sense.
definitely,
And
yeah.
this is an annual?
Yes.
An annual?
Yes, it's printed once a year. It takes the entire year, however, to get it done.
I see.
And then it culminates in the spring with the publication of the newspaper.
How did Borderlands get started?
Well, it started many years before I came to this campus. Actually, the project began in 1982 and was part of a grant project. And an institution called the Institute of Development and Economic Affairs Sources in Colorado, and then with a grant from EPCC, or the Fund for the Improvement of Secondary Education in Washington, D.C., allowed some instructors here or actually asked some instructors here at the college to do some research on the area and then find a viable source to either publish or produce the articles. And so for the first year, they produced some of these features on television, on some of the television stations. And then the second year, they produced the first publication in 1983.
Was there one person that that played a lead role in this, or that took much of the responsibility?
Yes, the late Glenn Spiegelhalder, who was a colleague of mine in the English department, really spearheaded the entire project. So we have Glenn to thank for this.
In the early years, what kinds of things did they focus on? What kinds of topics did they look at?
Well, actually, we're still doing some of the similar topics. They, of course, looked at the role of the Rio Grande in this area and everything that means as far as customs and the importance of water to the area and the history of the river and so on. But they also have looked at the employment situation here on the border and the way that it changes depending on the immigration situation at the time and so on. They've looked at individuals' faces on the border, various El Pasoans, interesting people who are unique. They've looked at the arts here on the border. Many people sometimes think that we're a desert as far as the arts are concerned, but you and I both know that's not true. They've looked at various phases of the history of this area, which is about 400 years old. So we're still doing some of these same topics. We don't seem to run out of topics.
And they change from time to time.
Absolutely.
They're interpreted differently, or we find out more information about them. So Borderlands is able to take a different spin or present a different spin on it.
Absolutely, yes. We could take the same article or the same topic and do 3 or 4 different articles on that topic because it's so different.
How did you get involved with Borderlands?
Well, I really owe that to several people, but actually my background is in folklore, and also I have a tremendous background in editing. I've been editing publications since I was in college, and so it's kind of up my alley. But in 1981, the chairman of our, or the chairperson of our discipline, Jeannie Foskett, asked me if I would consider it, because the editor at that time, who was Ruth Pena, was leaving. And so I jumped at it because it was just exactly what I would like to do.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about the process of putting an issue together. You said that it takes much of the year to actually do this. Where do you start with something like this?
Well, we start actually right after one issue is done. We start on the next issue. I talk with my editors, my former editors, and my artist and the photographer, and we talk about what would be fun as a new topic for the fall.
Who are the editors and photographers? These are students?
These are students, yes. These are EPCC students.
Great.
And of course, after they've done one issue, they're experts.
Sure.
Because they've been baptized by fire. And so we sit down and we talk about what we liked in this particular issue, what we weren't able to do. And sometimes that leads us to the topic for the next year.
So it's kind of in an evolutionary process. Every year you learn a little bit from what was done and change things a bit.
Yeah. And then we begin with a new semester in the fall.
Well, what happens there?
Okay. Well, my 3112 English classes, and that's research and critical writing, are welcomed with the news that they're in a very special 3112 class. So I tell them from the very first day that they're going to be writing and researching for a publication for Borderlands, and I give them the previous year issue, and we look at it carefully and we talk about it, and I tell them that they're going to be writing and researching about the place in which they live, and that's the El Paso area, maybe southern New Mexico, northern Mexico. And their first reaction is usually, but there's nothing to do here, there's nothing to research here. And of course they learn that that's not true very quickly. But so the first week I have them go to the library and they look at various articles. I give them a list of potential topics, and they go and do some preliminary reading in reserve books that I've put on reserve. And so they get an idea that, hey, there is a history here, you know?
Do they get a little worried about taking on this kind of responsibility? I think that maybe they might think, well, I can't do this.
I think they're impressed by the fact that scholars have actually written about this area. And then they look at the issue of Borderlands that I give them and say, hey, you know, somebody else did this, I can probably do it. And so it's a case of having to explain to them and let them see that we really do have a fascinating history, and they can be part of actually writing this history. So yes, I have to do some coercing and encouraging, but I usually don't have a problem getting them interested in the history of this area.
How do you get to the topics? Do they pick a topic, or?
Well, as I say, I give them a preliminary list of topics, and they usually look at my topics and say, nah, I don't like those. But they might pick one or two to go and do some preliminary research, and the happy outcome of that very often is that they find their own topics. And so I always like that. So I ask them for 2 or 3 topics to begin with, and I ask them to have done some reading on those topics so they have a basis. And it's in this first couple of weeks that they really come to decide on a topic that they can actually research. So it's, again, a process. The course 3112 is the process itself of research. So I have to let them handle this, and as much as they make the choice themselves, the happier I am, the more they do that. Sure. And so as long as it fits into the theme or the time structure that we're using, that's great.
And how does the research take place? Are there certain sources that you prefer that they use? Do they have to come up with their own sources?
Well, a little bit of both. Because the course is a process, we do everything step by step. And so one of the first things I have them do is to develop an annotated bibliography. So I have them begin with reserved books, and of course we use some wonderful El Paso histories written by people like C.L. Sonicson, Leon Metz, W.H. Timmons, people like that who are absolutely indispensable for the study of history in this area. And they learn about the sources that these people have used. And so they learn to go to some of these, and then it expands. And in doing their annotated bibliography, they are then led to periodicals and, of course, the internet. They have to eventually interview people. And so they are able to use a wide variety of sources. We have no problem with using 5, 7, sometimes 10 or 12 different types of sources, and many people will use anywhere from 15 to 20 sources. So they discover fairly soon that many people have written on this area, and there are knowledgeable people out in the community that they can interview.
And how does the article take shape that a student is writing? Who decides on the length or the scope of it? How does that happen?
Well, when we get to the article phase of it, the editors and I do a great deal of that. But before that happens, the students write a research paper of about 1,800 to 2,000 words on their particular topic. And of course, this is academic writing, and so it's very different from the journalistic feature articles that we eventually do. So I grade their research papers, and then what we do is I ask them to make 2 copies of the research paper, one to be graded and then one for the Borderlands staff to look at. Oh. So we go through the research papers when they come in, and we start looking at those that appear to be different or very well researched or a little off the beaten track, or that kind of thing. And so we do a very close reading of all of them, and we do some preliminary choosing that way. Actually, the articles then are turned into feature articles in journalistic writing by the editors and by myself.
Oh, I see. So it's the research paper is eventually turned into a newspaper-type article.
Exactly, yeah. And all of the students in the 3112 classes get a little bit of training in journalistic writing, because what we do is we take their research paper, and I ask them, after a little bit of training, about feature articles and leads and so on, I ask them to imagine what their story might be like if they were writing it for Borderlands, if they themselves were doing the writing. And so they have to produce a couple of leads from their own research papers. So that gives them an idea of the difference between journalistic writing and academic writing.
Have we had some interesting or unique stories over the years that have come out of Borderlands?
There have been so many, George, and I wish I could tell you about all of them. And they vary from very historical to something that is of interest mainly to the El Paso area. One of my editors was Sandra Pierce. She was an editor for 2 or 3 years, as a matter of fact. And she did a wonderful paper, and she actually turned her own paper into the feature article as editor on the drive-in restaurants in the 1950s here in El Paso. And it was such a phenomenon. And she traced people all the way up to Washington who had owned such restaurants and so on, and just had a really good time with this. It was a very difficult piece to do at the time, especially. But another one of my editors was Chris Fumagalli, and he did a very interesting article on cabeza de vaca for an issue a couple of years ago. And what was interesting about it, I think we've all heard the term, or we've read about cabeza de vaca in our history books, but he gave us the story of where this man's name came from, which was really fun. But he traced his travels from his landing in the New World on the island of Santo Domingo to Florida, to the mouth of the Mississippi, and then his travels throughout what is now the state of Texas. And what I really was pleased with, and I learned from every one of these articles, was the fact that Cabeza de Vaca was one of the first white surgeons in the New World, and he learned these techniques from the various Indian tribes that he met along the way. So it's that kind of really digging down deep that I think makes for an interesting article.
Sure.
And of course there have been many, many more. Another one by a young lady named Angelica Gutierrez was on the southern Tijuas, who are right here in town. But what was fascinating there was their relationship to the northern Tijuas and their part in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and how they got down here. And I think a lot of people might be interested in knowing that they once were part of the northern tribe, and that's why they're called Isleta del Sur, or the southern Isleta tribe. So I think all of them are fascinating, and like I say, I sound really smart because I learned so much history from my students.
Sure. Have students gone on to pursue communications or journalism or English degrees or careers after working on Borderlands?
Well, I have some who tell me that they have gotten really gotten the bug in journalism and English and yes, even history.
Great.
And it has helped them make a decision in life because they have discovered the importance of research, not just in academic writing, but the importance of research in everyday life.
Sure.
They've also found an appreciation of the El Paso area that was not there before, and I always like to see that. And so, yes, we have had a number of students who have decided to go into the writing phase, either in English or in journalism and history. And we've also had some people who have had some happy experiences out in the community as either interns or volunteers in various organizations or park situations based on what their research has taught them. One young lady became a volunteer for an organization after she wrote about it, and this was the McGoffin Home.
Oh.
Which a lot of people don't realize is right here, downtown El Paso. And of course, she had to tour it extensively, and she interviewed some of the McGoffin heirs. And she discovered that it was about to be closed as a park. This was several years ago. And so she got involved in the fundraising and in the volunteer program down there, and really came to appreciate where she lived. She's now a pharmacist.
Oh, that's terrific.
So I'm very proud of her. So we've had a number of students who have had such experiences because of Borderlands.
Is there a certain background that a student would need to get involved in Borderlands? Could any of our students participate?
Absolutely. The only requirement they need is they're ready for English 3112. That means that their writing skills are pretty good. And after that, it's mainly a lot of hard work. I do have students who tell me every year that they've never worked this hard in a class. And I have to admit that 3112 is a difficult class for a lot of people anyway because of the research component. It takes hours and hours and hours. They have to eat, sleep, and play research, and that's new to many of our students, and so it's difficult. But everybody who's ready for 3112 could, I think, benefit from writing and researching about the place where they live. Usually it's the place where we live that we know the least about, or very often. And we have to wait until we have visitors from the outside to learn about our own city. So this way, it's a little bit of forced learning about their own city.
And you're able to draw all of your editors and design and photography people and that, often from the people that worked on the issue before?
Well, we have very, very talented students, as you will probably agree. And so at the very beginning, I do an information card, and little do they know, I'm already fishing for talent. I ask about their artistic skills. I ask about their photographic skills, and I tell them they cannot be humble. They have to tell me. I ask about their computer skills, because they have all of the work that they produce in 3112 is done on a word processor. And so from this, I get to learn a little bit about them right offhand. And then the other thing that I ask them to do, I give them an option for extra credit to illustrate their research papers. And the two areas that I really push are original art and photographs. So naturally, this gives me, or gives the staff, the source for some of the illustrations. And when we've done historical topics, as we have the past few years, the past several years, as a matter of fact, they also learned that the downtown El Paso Library has an archive of historical photos. So they get to learn a little bit about research as far as photographs are concerned. And so many of them make copies of appropriate photographs and include them in their projects.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about this year's issue, which is coming out very soon. And I guess in order to do that, we really have to go back to last year to find out what people thought might be interesting to work with.
Yeah.
What topic did they come up with?
In 1999, we concentrated on the late 1800s, particularly the 1880s, and we ended with the coming of the railroad, which was 1881. So my editor said, there's so much material here, why don't we continue where we left off? And that would have been in the 1880s. So that's exactly what we did. And instead of stopping at the 1900s, we pushed it a little bit. So this year we're looking at the 1880s through the 1920s, but our emphasis here is on some of the civilizing influences that took this very rough and tumble town of El Paso and made it into the city that it became. So we're looking at the first schools, we're looking at some of the first churches, various religious orders such as the Jesuits, who really took over after the Franciscan influence here. We're looking at the Sisters of Loretto, the Sisters of Charity, the first hospitals, which came from some of these religious orders. And then we go into some of the difficulties that occurred in the 1900s, such as the flu epidemic, and the fact that so many Easterners came out here in order to survive tuberculosis. And that also helped the development of our hospital system here. And then we end with the effects of Prohibition, both on El Paso and Juarez. So we're kind of looking at the qualities, the ideals, and those things that welcomed families here and allowed families to settle here in El Paso.
And this is a very important period of time because this is when El Paso is really developing into a city. It's not really a city before the railroad.
No, that's right. You know, before the railroad came, there were only about 500 to 700 people here. Just a year later, there were 1,500, and then it just mushroomed from then. So by the time 1920 comes, I think we have about 75,000 people. So we're really a big city.
How does the Prohibition era tie into this? I imagine there's some interesting El Paso connections there.
Yeah, there really are. Of course, you know, Prohibition here on the border was not the same thing as Prohibition in the Midwest or the South or the Northeast, because what people did was just cross the border to have their drinks. The breweries, the distilleries here in this part of Texas just packed up and moved across the border. It's a phenomenon, unfortunately, that businesses still do today. But it really developed Juarez as a tourist place because they not only did they provide liquor here across the border, but they provided all kinds of entertainment for tourists. So El Paso really advertised itself as the the place where you could have a vacation in two nations. And so it helped develop El Paso's hotel and lodging areas, and then developed Juarez as the entertainment place. So people didn't make their own booze like they did in other parts of the country. They didn't have to. All they had to do was go across the border. Yeah.
Just briefly, are there some plans for the next edition of Borderlands? Do we have some things to look forward to next year that are in the works?
Well, I hope so. We have several articles that we weren't able to publish this year, and they have to do with some of the real characters or the types of characters that we had as a wild, wild west town. And of course, those are the gunfighters and the lawmen who were often previously gunfighters. But people like Billy the Kid and his activities in San Elizario, for instance. And
maybe we can look forward in some of the future issues to working with those topics. Ruth, we want to thank you so much for coming in and visiting with us today on Along the Rio Grande. And we want to thank all of you as well, and hope to see you on our next program.